All right, so today's agenda, we'll be getting started with grant year 19. So we will list out what needs to be in place prior to reimbursements and also what Youth Build USA will provide to get you up and running with building an AmeriCorps reimbursement request. Next, we will find out if you are RAD. So if you've ever been to an AmeriCorps fiscal training, I'm sure you know what RAD is. RAD is how we define what is allowable for reimbursements. So we'll give an overview of documentation requirements and key areas of federal compliance. After that, we'll get into the AmeriCorps reimbursement packet. So this will be an overview of how to use the workbooks you'll find in Dropbox for grant year 1920. After that, a general overview of the AmeriCorps monitoring process and how the reimbursement process works at Youth Build USA. And finally, we'll leave you with some best practices and resources to hopefully get you started out on the right foot. All right, so getting started with grant year 19. Before we get into reimbursement, it's important to point out a few requirements that need to be in place prior to receiving your AmeriCorps reimbursement packet for 1920. So while a lot of programs may have their packet, there may be something in the process that is holding that up. And you can always reach out to your financial manager to see if that is the case. So if you have not received your grant year 1920 packet, it might be because of one of these items is currently pending. Things such as the signed AmeriCorps subgrantee agreement, the financial management survey, which was new to grant year 1920, a copy of your most recent audit, which is likely 2018, and obviously a approved AmeriCorps budget for grant year 1920. And there is always a few miscellaneous things that can go along with AmeriCorps budgets, including an indirect cost rate letter if you have a federally approved indirect cost rate, a consultant form if you have any consultants in your budget, in-kind commitment letters for any in-kind sources of match that are in your budget. So those in-kind commitment letters verifying that those funds will be provided, or those resources will be provided throughout the grant year. And criminal history checks for verified for new staff. So once those pieces are in place, you will receive a grant year 1920 reimbursement packet email that will let you know that your packet is available in Dropbox, as well as connecting you to some of the resources to help get you started. So you'll get your reimbursement templates for the new year. That includes a copy of your approved 1920 budget, the current expense and match workbook, a copy of the staff summary, and then a number of written instructions. So we'll talk about most of these today, but if you're looking for an actual print version of these instructions, you can find it in your Dropbox. These include reimbursement paperwork instructions, so how to fill out the paperwork required for an AmeriCorps reimbursement request, documentation requirements, so what suffices as sufficient backup documentation for your expenses, as well as a reimbursement review checklist that will guide you along your reimbursement request to make sure everything is in place prior to submitting. All right, do we have any questions at this point? Nope, okay, I will throw it over to Baruch Tate to talk about RAD.
Thank you, Brandon. Sorry. Trying to. Okay, so for any cost to be billed to your AmeriCorps grant, it has to meet these 4 broad requirements. The expense has to be reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. As part of our budget review process at the beginning of every grant year, we look at all the costs listed on your budget and ensure that they are RAD. So we have covered this extensively in our previous webinar called AmeriCorps Grant Startup and Budgets. If you haven't attended that webinar, I highly recommend it, and you can find it in our YouTube channel, Use Build AmeriCorps. So once your AmeriCorps budget is approved, you are ready to submit your ARR, your AmeriCorps Reimbursement Request. So in this section, I will cover the kind of documentations you need to submit in order to receive your reimbursement request. So let's start with your AmeriCorps General Ledger. So we request a program to submit a General Ledger with their monthly reimbursement request. We recognize that every program might have a different general ledger, like structurally, but every general ledger needs to include all the expenses listed in your expense worksheet, and the total amount should match with what you have on the expense worksheet, as well as FSR form. So the expenses on the general ledger need to be separated by grant year, if you have different grant years for AmeriCorps, and it should detail or transactions. In addition to that, if you have a memo section of the general ledger, that would be a good place to let us know if there is anything you want us to pay attention to. So a general ledger is a requirement for your monthly reimbursement request. So the next cost we are highlighting is your personnel expense. So there are two important sort of documentations you need to submit related to your personnel expense. Those are staff timesheet and payroll documentation. So the staff timesheet should indicate the actual hours worked by the employee, and also they need to be allocated by different funding source if it is applicable to your program. In addition, the payroll documentation should show gross pay as well as fringe. The payroll documentation can vary from program to program, but the standard would be it needs to show the gross pay and fringe. So some programs have their own customized staff timesheet, and some use our template. So whether you are using your own staff timesheet or you are using what we provide, there are important things that staff timesheet need to include. Those are, it should indicate the employee name, it should properly allocate time. As I mentioned, if an employee works on different grants, their time needs to be allocated based on your cost allocation plan. And it also needs to include signature and date. So this is something we catch mostly when we're reviewing your reimbursement request. It might be missing a signature, or it might not be properly allocated between different grants, and that could delay your reimbursement request when we're requesting for an updated or a corrected timesheet. So just three things you need to pay attention to. It needs to include an employee name, it needs to be allocated properly based on your cost allocation plan, and it needs to include your employee and supervisor signature. So once you have your staff timesheet and payroll ledger, you would use the information from these two documents to fill out the staff summary. So staff summary is template we provide in order to, make it clear for us as a reviewer how you are allocating your time between AmeriCorps and Match. So if you can see in this template, it's very similar to every grant year. So this is for 17-18, but your 19-20 staff summary would also look very similar to this. So when you have at the beginning of the grant year, we will fill out the CHC date and the staff name as well as the position, and it will be readily available to you on the Dropbox. So every month you will use this staff summary and the payroll ledger to fill out different sections. You need to fill out the total number of hours and then allocate it to AmeriCorps and Match based on your staff timesheet. And then using the payroll ledger information, you need to fill out the gross salary. Once you have this information, this Excel sheet is designed to automatically calculate what you need for expense and Match. So this is the information you would use to fill out your expense and Match worksheet. So it's very important that you have this structure of looking at your staff summary, payroll ledger, and filling out your staff summary. So this is just summarizing what I just mentioned. It needs to indicate both your personal expense, including fringe benefits. So let's look at travel. So in your AmeriCorps budget, staff travel is split into two, that including staff travel and member travel. Staff travel could be your, your expenses related to your travel to attend your AmeriCorps management conference, or any other travel related to the grant. That include lodging, meals, and these expenses need to be itemized and clearly show the date and the purpose of the trip. And if you have members, sorry, I think it's just somehow skipped. Sorry, everyone. Okay, sorry. I'm not sure what happened there. And to just continue what I was saying, if you have a member travel related to public transport, you need to submit a member sign-in sheet. So the most important thing to take away from this would be that your expenses related to staff and member travel need to be reasonable and should align with your organization's internal travel policy. And if you have any question, obviously you can reach out to us around travel and what you need to include and what you need to submit to receive reimbursement. For supplies, the most common requests we get under supply would be service gear, office supplies, and AmeriCorps signage. The important thing here would be if you are submitting a request for office supplies, you need to ensure that the costs are allocated, properly allocated based on your cost allocation plan. And if you have a member service gear, it needs to show your AmeriCorps logo, the AmeriCorps logo on the outfit you are purchasing. So if you have any question around supplies, we highly recommend that you reach out to us before you submit your monthly reimbursement request, and that would remove any delay after submitting your reimbursement request. The other section on your AmeriCorps reimbursement request is contractual and consultant service. For this, we request an invoice that shows the cost of the work, the dates of service, and the rate paid and the total amount paid. We actually have a template to help programs outline what we need when you have an outside contractor. If you have your own template, you are welcome to use it, but this form is also available in our Dropbox if you need it. The next section is training. So if you have a staff member who traveled to our AmeriCorps Management Conference, you would split the travel cost and then anything related to training. For instance, you need to submit the copy of the agenda, or if it is an internal training, you need to submit a sign-in sheet. And any invoice you show us should include the name of the training, the date, and who among your staff member or a member attended the training. So any cost associated to the travel should be reported as travel, and anything associated to the training, like paying for the training, would be part of this training line item. So the other section in your budget would be the operating cost. The most common operating cost for programs is a background check, and the only thing you need to submit is a copy of your after you conducted the background check. We have occupancy. That's another thing you need to pay attention to and really refer back to your cost allocation plan and ensure that any expense under occupancy has been properly allocated. That's something we really look out. If you have a rent, for instance, and you have different grants under your program, you need to ensure that the rent has been properly allocated. If you have any question, obviously you can reach out to us. As part of our resource in our Dropbox, we have a cost allocation template. If you don't have one already within your program, you can also use that to help you, allocate any expenses under operating costs. Not many of our programs have a full-time member, but if you have a full-time member, you need to include a payroll report. And at the beginning of the grant year, before you start charging the member cost to the grant, we request for a proof of health insurance. And we also have a member living allowance to better help you report any member expenses. This is what the template of the member living allowance summary looks like. And when you receive the grant, when you are starting out the grant, you will find this in your Dropbox. And the things you need to fill out on this form would be the member name and the biweekly rate. And then every month you will be filling out the expense or the match section of this this member living allowance. And it's a requirement for your monthly reimbursement request. So far under documentation, we have covered a general ledger, personal expense, travel, supplies, training, consultant services, operating cost, and member service cost. All of them might not apply to you, although general ledger applies generally to all programs. Not all of them will apply to all programs, but one thing you need to pay attention to is any expense you are reporting on a monthly basis to AmeriCorps, they need to be reasonable, allowable, allocable, and documented. And as I mentioned, we have more resources that delve deeper into what RAD is, and we'll be sharing that later in this webinar. And I will pass it to Michael now. Thank you.
Thank you, Barikte. I guess first we'll ask if anyone has any quick questions about what Barikte just covered. If not, we'll move on. Doesn't look like it, so let's, oh, okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the AmeriCorps reimbursement packet. This is the main tool you're going to use to submit your monthly reimbursement request to us. And of course, as always, you can find this in Dropbox. Again, if you ever have any issues with Dropbox or need access to Dropbox, please contact us and we'll be happy to set that up for you at any time. The main parts of the AmeriCorps reimbursement packet we're going to go over today are the expense and match workbook and all the parts that make up it, the staff summary, and the member living allowance. But we'll mostly just be covering that first one. Unfortunately, we can't do any polls due to some technical issues, so we'll be skipping this. So this is the first thing we're going to cover in your expense and match workbook, and this is a tab titled How to Submit a Reimbursement. This is a little simple, helpful place for you to get any information you might need related to reimbursements. I would recommend that if you have any questions during your monthly work on our grant, you first check this page, and you probably will be able to find the answer to a question you have. There's a lot of helpful stuff on here, including your due date, links to our help desk, links to our YouTube, and a whole bunch of other helpful tools created by both us and CNCS for you to properly submit for reimbursement. So the next part here is the financial status report, or the FSR for short. It makes up a significant part of your ARR. It's kind of a overall snapshot of your grant. It's an important piece that we use to make sure that you're being reimbursed properly every month. And it's made up of a couple of different parts that we're going to go into. So here you can see that it breaks down your grant between both match and AMC expense, that being AmeriCorps expense. You can see that match is referred to as recipient share of outlays, and the expense part is referred to as federal share of outlays, recipient being your share, aka match, and federal being the part reimbursed by the federal government. Again, also you can see that it's split up between previously reported, your current reported or this period, and of course cumulative. And you should always keep these numbers in mind. And you should keep these numbers in mind because you should always check your year-to-dates and previously reported numbers. Very frequently, due to both workbook and user error, older months will be augmented without knowing or accidentally, and there will be a year-to-date issue. So always check these numbers to make sure they line up, and that if they don't line up, try to figure out what happened to make them not line up. This is something we frequently see happen over the course of your grant year, and it can cause a little bit of an issue. Another number to keep in mind is in the lower right-hand corner. That circled number is your total grant award. Always make sure that this shows your accurate grant award. If you've received a grant increase and you don't see that this number is correct, please contact your FM, and we'll be happy to fix that for you. And again, most importantly, always remember to sign your FSR. FSR without a signature is not permittable by us. We will have you go back and sign it, and it can cause hiccups along the pipeline. So the next part of your expense and match workbook is the copy of your most recent budget. Whether you've done a budget mod or not, this should be your most recent completed and approved budget. We're not going to go into detail about the budget here, but as Brigitte said earlier, I implore you, if you have any questions about budgeting, the budgeting process, or anything related to your budget, please go back and watch our grant startup and budget webinar that we did in the summer. You can find it on our YouTube, and it should answer any questions you have on your budget at this time. And on to the bread and butter. So this is the expense worksheet. This is where the majority of your reporting will happen. As you can see, it's broken out month to month, and also broken out line to line from what you have in your most recent and approved budget. Very simply, each month as you report numbers to us, you should go down line by line and insert each number, and making sure that each line matches up with the numbers that you want to report to us, what you have backup documentation for, and what is being reported in your general ledger. We'll typically do the same thing when we review. We will go line by line, making sure each line lines up with your report documentation that you've reported to us. The next helpful tool here is your match worksheet. So this is largely very similar to your expense worksheet. How you interact with it will be mostly the same. Again, go line by line, item by item, and make sure you're reporting the correct numbers that you want to report to us in here. It should be noted that if you enter any of these numbers incorrectly, if you make a typo, these automatically will feed into your FSR, and you will not have a correct total for each month. So it's very important that these numbers are correct when you report them. There's one major difference between the expense and match workbook, and we'll look at it here. So this is your match source reporting, which you can find at the bottom of your match workbook. This is the main difference between it and the expense workbook. And this is where you're going to report and allocate your match monthly to us. So you should have all of your match sources that you have on your budget there on your match workbook. And each month as you report match, you will be going to the bottom and inserting and allocating the amount of money to each match source that you spent. So for example, if you spent $5,000 in August, you would allocate that $5,000 between all three of the match sources here. That should line up with your budgeted match reasonably. You are allowed to go over as you don't know exactly what you're going to spend month to month when the beginning of the grant year is happening. And it should line up one-to-one with your build match, meaning that the net that you see there should be 0, as the document says. If it's not, we will ask you to report that match correctly, and it could cause hiccups in the issue. So we talked about this a little bit, so I'm not going to go into huge detail, but this is, again, the staff summary. It should be noted that when you input things into this, you only have to input the hours and gross salary, and everything else will be calculated automatically by the document, meaning you just put in total hours, the AmeriCorps hours, paid time off, and same for match, gross salary, and all the cells that are in gray to the right will be automatically calculated, and this will decide what you are able to input into your expense and match workbook. It should be noted that you should not forget to calculate fringe. You can see at the bottom, you can have your calculations, your own personal organization's fringe rates in there, and calculate your fringe expenses for each month. And again, we're not going to go into huge detail because this is going to be covered, this has already been covered a little bit, but this is the member living allowance summary. This is only going to be relevant if you have a full-time or half-time member, and you will have to submit this monthly to us. I do want to take this time to plug a full-time and half-time member webinar that Brandon Keffer will be doing. The date for that is November 19th. If I'm wrong, Brandon, please correct me. But if your program does have a full-time or half-time member that is receiving a member living allowance, you should definitely be attending that webinar because he will be going into detail about all the financial requirements that adds to your grant. If you do not have a full-time or half-time member earning a living allowance, you should not need to attend that webinar unless you foresee in the future your program requesting one. So last but not least, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you should be reviewing your submissions to us. This is kind of an important part in the process where you make sure that everything you want to submit is correct. I always say just double check everything. You should double check that the numbers you reported in the expense and match workbook match up with the documentation you're submitting to us. You should double check that those numbers in your match the numbers match what's reported in your ledger, meaning that the general ledger that you're submitting to us monthly lines up with what you're submitting for both expense and match. And of course, you should always ask yourself, are these expenses RAD? There are certain line items in your budget that we will not be able to tell if are RAD or not based on just what they are in your budget. For example, office supplies is a very broad, overarching cost that includes many things that would be considered RAD and would not be considered RAD. So again, always ask yourself if these costs are RAD. If you are ever unsure, you should always reach out to your FM before submitting for reimbursement. If you have any concerns about if a cost is allowable or not, it's usually a quick phone call where we will say yes or no, and that will nip any problems in the bud before they happen. For the rare instances where we have more complicated issues, where the question is we'll have to figure it out, we can start looking into federal documents and other tools that allow us to determine if those costs are RAD or not. So again, always ask us ahead of time. The last tool I want to point you to is the Financial Reimbursement Review Checklist. And this is kind of a tool that you can use to get inside of our minds a little bit. It's going to go section by section of your workbook and basically list out the standards to which that we review your submissions every month in. And it's a good tool to use if you want to review your own submissions before submitting them to us. You can just go down the checklist, check everything off as you see that you've done, as you see it, to show that you have done them correctly, and that way you know if you've missed anything glaring before you actually submit to us. So always remember that that checklist is there for you to use if you ever need it. Does anyone have any questions related to your expense and match workbooks or any of the workbooks in general? And it doesn't look like it. So with that, I'm going to throw it back to Brandon.
All right, thanks, Michael. All right, so now we have a complete AmeriCorps reimbursement request. So what do we do with it? So you'll submit via Dropbox. So if you've been working with us for a number of years, I'm sure you're familiar with Dropbox. If for some reason you do not have a Dropbox account, you can always reach out to your financial manager to get you connected to that. We always ask that once you submit a reimbursement to Dropbox that you also notify AmeriCorps FSR at youthbuild.org, just so we have a heads up to go into Dropbox and start that process. So to give you a glimpse of the AmeriCorps monitoring process, the AmeriCorps Reimbursement Request is our primary way of conducting routine monitoring. So this is a federal reimbursement grant, which means you will be reporting and submitting documentation each month that the grant is active. So as we've overviewed today, a complete reimbursement request includes the amounts being billed to the grant for reimbursements. It also includes the amounts being reported as match, and then all of the backup documentation to support those expenses. And to be honest with you, there are so many requirements with more than one way to meet them. So our monthly monitoring focuses on just the broad strokes. So generally, we look at areas where programs struggle the most. We don't look at every system, policy, and procedure behind every reported number. That's more of something what an audit firm would do. So we're not auditors, we're just here to help protect this investment and look at ways we can mitigate risk. So let's talk about policies and procedures and systems all of you should have in place to meet federal grant requirements, and which allow your program to prepare and submit AmeriCorps reimbursement requests each month. So first, at the top of our monitoring pyramid here, we have an effective accounting system. So what that means is you're itemizing each expenditure and it's readily identifiable to the grant. And expenditures for a grant must be readily and logically assignable to the approved budget. So if an outside auditor were looking at your general ledger, they should be able to make a clear connection back to the budget. Next, we have a strong financial management requirements. So things such as accounting policies and procedures, a cost allocation plan, staff time and effort policy, human resources policies, travel policies, and staff position descriptions. And then finally, the ability to run a good financial management system. So do you document payroll through time and attendance records and payroll tax records? Do you maintain written cost allocation procedures and individual time distribution records that allow the program to identify and separate costs chargeable to the grant? And finally, are financial responsibilities separated? Programs who don't have good financial systems or accounting systems or lack written policies and procedures could see a delay in the review of reimbursement requests. It may also mean, in certain circumstances, discontinued allocation of funds if the policies in question are really integral to managing these funds. And so all in all, we're looking to mitigate risk. We're not going to audit every single aspect of your program's financial system. So really, to boil it down, if you're looking for the regulations that apply to the reimbursement request, your best resource is really, as Michael mentioned, to go to that review checklist that is in your expense and match workbook. This will take you through each section of your budget. So regardless of what types of expenses you bill, whether it be supplies, member support costs, staff costs, it'll walk you through some of the more specific regulations to make sure that your documentation is in order. As far as getting reimbursed, we prepare drawdowns on a weekly basis, usually at the beginning of the week, and funds usually are deposited that following Friday. In general, we say funds usually take about a week to arrive after they've been placed into the drawdown. Recently, we've been experiencing a few delays as we've been implementing a new accounts payable system. So you might have experienced a few delays recently, but once things are sort of humming along, it's usually about a week to receive funds. And just a note, so we are talking about grant year 1920, but grant year 1819 is still very much alive. As long as you have active members under that grant year, you can continue billing expenses. or until you've utilized all of the fundings and met the 50% match requirements. So you may be submitting a few 18-19 requests alongside grant year 19-20. And if you're just getting started with grant year 19-20, you want to start with August 2019. Even if you don't have members enrolled at the beginning of the grant year, you'll still want to submit those FSRs just to verify that there were, in fact, no expenses. All right, I'll pause there. Any questions so far? And if not, I will turn it over to Johnny.
Thank you, Brandon. Sorry about that. Okay, so in this section, I'll be going over best practices and resources. I'll cover the timeline, so when do you need to submit and when you'll receive your reimbursements. I'll also go over budget modifications and lastly, the resources available to you. So at the start of the grant year, you'll be assigned 3 possible due dates, the 16th, the 23rd, and the 30th. These dates help us divvy up the work on our end, so just please have that documentation in Dropbox by your assigned date. We understand that sometimes you cannot meet your assigned date for various reasons. If this is the case, let us know and we can change your due date or provide an extension. As far as reimbursements, we reimburse on a month-to-month basis and we review and approve on a first-come, first-served basis as well. So it's important that you submit by your due date so you don't lose your spot. That said, if you submit 2 reimbursements at a time, please expect a delay. Once your reimbursement is approved, it goes through a process managed by our fiscal office, and as Brandon mentioned, it may take up to a week for the reimbursement to appear in your bank account. You can contact us if you have any concerns or questions about this reimbursement process. Okay, moving on to budget mods. So when do you need a budget mod? You would need a budget mod for 2 reasons. First one would be that your combined negative subtotals are over 10%, 10% more of your total budget. So remember, your total budget is your expense and match. So you may bill over your budgeted line items. Again, it's not until you reach that 10% threshold. If you have any questions about this, please reach out to us. We can take a look at your budget together. You will also need a budget mod if you need to include an additional line item like supplies or training. But the most common reason for a budget mod is adding a new staff member. So I'm going to go over that in just a bit. But it's important to remember the flow. So if you need a budget mod, if you need to change a budget, you will also need to modify the expense report, which changes the FSR. And if you're adding a new person, a new staff member, you will also need a new staff summary. So let's assume you want to add a new staff member. The first thing you should do is to contact your financial manager. You will then be instructed to complete a budget modification under a new tab within your budget. And once you're done with that, you would contact your financial manager. We will review and approve it, and in the end, we will send you an updated expense and match report along with the new staff summary. We will provide that feedback after you submit your mod. So again, it's important that you let us know as soon as you're done to prevent any delays. So it looks something like this. So you will request your mod, we will review it, and then we'll update your spreadsheets. So another best practice I'd like to cover is program fiscal communication. Overall, I think it's important for fiscal staff and program staff to be in constant communication with each other, but it's especially important when you want to do things like adding a new staff member. So I just covered how that process looks like on my end. But it's a little bit different for the program manager. Program managers have to confirm criminal history checks. So it's important for your program manager person to send all that backup documentation to your program manager. So that flow information will expedite the modification process. So the program review process through the lens of a fiscal or financial manager lens looks like this. You would contact both your program manager and financial manager about your new staff member. Your program manager will review that backup documentation you provided, and then your program manager will let us know directly if this person is cleared. We will then add everything to the budget mod and update all the spreadsheets. And remember that you can only bill after the staff member's criminal history check is cleared. So it's after the program manager approves it is that you can start billing. So if you have any questions about criminal history checks, please contact your program manager directly. They are the best resource you have for everything program related. So in addition to having your financial manager and your program manager, you also have access to a ton of resources online, as Brandon mentioned. You can find this webinar and all previous webinars online. We also have budget instructions, documentation requirements, and even a YouTube playlist. So please take a second to review the resources out there. And you can find them, or you can find most of them in our help docs website listed on the screen right there below.